Hello everyone, thanks for tuning in to today's video. Today's video is going to focus on El Nino and La Nina. Now the first thing we need to talk about is the name El Nino. Why is it El Nino? Well, that is Spanish for the little boy. And the reason they use that name is that El Nino is usually at its peak around Christmas time. So the little boy, Christ child, that is why we have the name El Nino. Now what is El Nino? Well, this chart really shows it up quite well. This is from December 1997 when there was a very intense El Nino going on. It was one of the severest El Nino effects ever recorded, and we can see that the El Nino is here across the Pacific. El Nino is really where warm water rises up through the Pacific and comes to the surface from Peru across the equatorial Pacific over to Indonesia. And this warm water, as I say, rises to the surface and has a dramatic impact on the global weather setup. It's more particularly a phenomena for the southern hemisphere, but it does impact the northern hemisphere as well, and this is a good indication of the effects that El Nino has. We do see that in the June to August period, which is when El Nino really starts, we start to get very dry weather across much of Indonesia, and we start to see wet weather developing through the equatorial Pacific and back towards Peru and down towards Chile. We tend to get dry weather across parts of Mexico and into the Caribbean. That's because we get less in the way of hurricanes. That's really all the effect that we see to start off with, but once we get to the December to February period, which is really when El Nino is at its peak, we do see very intense droughts. We tend to see very intense droughts across much of Indonesia and down into Australia. Australia can be very warm and dry indeed, and we get wet weather as extending from the equatorial Pacific through to Peru. And then when we go further north and we see very wet weather, we can see very wet weather around California and much of Texas and on into Florida. And then further north we tend to get quite warm weather around Alaska and parts of the Pacific Northwest of Canada and the United States. So that's El Nino. La Nina is something completely different, and it's like the reversal really of El Nino. So La Nina is when cold water comes up to the surface, and that cold water spreads across the Pacific from Peru again over to Indonesia, and as I say, this is the reversal of El Nino. So it's in exactly the same place as the El Nino, but instead of being warm water, it's cold water. So El Nino is the warming effect and La Nina is the cooling effect. Now the implications of La Nina are of course the reverse of El Nino, as it is a reversal. So instead of being very wet from Peru to Indonesia, we have it very dry. Indonesia itself tends to become very wet, and it is often very wet down into Australia. We had some quite severe flooding in Australia just over a year ago. That was generally down to the La Nina effect. And further north, instead of having very wet weather extending from California to Texas to Florida, we get very dry weather from California to Florida. And Texas can have very severe droughts indeed in La Nina years. And again, further north, the effect is the completely reversal. So instead of having warm weather across Alaska and the Pacific Northwest of Canada and the United States, we get cold and wet weather up here. Now notice that for Europe and for us in Britain, the effects of both El Nino and La Nina are not that common. We see that we've got this big white area here indicating that we don't tend to see constant effects of these El Nino and La Nina events. So we see that for El Nino there's nothing really showing up for Europe and the UK. And again, it's the same for La Nina. Now that doesn't mean that these effects don't have implications for us, because they certainly can do, but it just means that we don't see a common implication from these events. But even so, we can get some quite extreme weather during these events. So, for instance, in 1998 we had an exceptionally warm February, and there is quite a bit of speculation that that February was probably, partly at least, caused by the intense El Nino event that was going on at that time. So they can have implications for us, these El Nino and La Nina events, but really it's more of a global phenomenon, and the implications for Europe are much less understood. Now, the current situation across the Pacific is that we actually have a La Nina fading. We've been in La Nina conditions across much of the Pacific for really since the middle of 2010, but that La Nina is starting to fade away, and we've still got the leftover of that La Nina across these western parts of the equatorial Pacific. But further east, this is quite interesting because we're starting to see warming taking place from the coast of Chile up into Peru, and that warming effect is beginning now to spread out just into parts of the El Nino regions, the regions that we need to look at to see whether we get an El Nino or a La Nina effect. So this implies that the La Nina is certainly finishing. It's almost at an end. We've been under La Nina conditions for around 2 years, and now we're looking at a change taking place around Peru and Chile, and we need to see whether that change is going to lead us into an El Nino event. And I do think that we could start to see an El Nino event as we go through this year. This is the climate model from the US. This is NOAA. This is the ensemble mean for the climate model for the ENSO region, for the El Nino region. We do see that the model is starting to lift the El Nino forecast up into positive territory. So this does imply that we are going to see an El Nino beginning to take place as we go through this year. Now, this model is going for quite a weak El Nino, but it's early days because it won't really get going until the late spring or early summer, and it won't be at its peak, as we explained, until Christmas. So we do need to keep an eye on this, because it does look as though we are starting to see the first signs of El Nino beginning to take shape. This is the JAMS-TEC model. This is the long-range model from Japan, and again we see that for the summer period, for June, July and August, the model is going for warming across the central parts of the equatorial Pacific. Again, this is a good signal that El Nino is starting to take shape. Now, the model actually weakens this as we go into the autumn. So once we get through to September to November, the model is actually going for a weakening from what we see in the summer. This would be quite unusual. This wouldn't normally happen. Normally you would see it continuing to strengthen as we go into the autumn, and again, as I've explained, it reaches its peak around Christmas. So I think we have to take this with a bit of a pinch of salt, because if the model is right for June to August, then it would imply that we should really see a continuing strengthening of the El Nino event through September, October, November, and reach its peak in December. Beijing model, this is the long-range model from China. We can't see the sea surface temperatures with this model, but we can see the precipitation forecast. This is for July to September, and the model is going for quite a bit of precipitation, more than normal, across the central parts of the Pacific, stretching back into Peru. And as we've explained, one of the effects of El Nino is that you do see increased rainfall across these central parts of the Pacific, stretching from Peru back towards Indonesia. So the model, if you take this forecast of precipitation from the Beijing model, this forecast does imply that there is an El Nino event taking shape across these central and eastern parts of the Pacific. So it's early days on this, but it does look, I think, as though the models are picking up on a signal for El Nino to develop through this year. It will start probably in the late spring In fact, it's beginning to warm, as we saw already across the coast of Chile and Peru, but it'll really start getting going around the late spring, early summertime, and it'll continue to strengthen most probably through the course of this summer and into the autumn, and reach its peak around Christmas. Now, this will have a warming effect on the planet, so as we go through the second half of this year, if this does happen, this El Nino event, we will start to hear reports about how the planet is warming once again, but it won't be down to global warming, this particular warming through the second half of the year. It'll be down to the El Nino event. And we will start to hear reports about extreme weather taking place across the Earth, because, as I say, we do get some very unusual weather patterns beginning to develop when El Nino is at its peak. So we'll keep an eye on this, because it could be quite important as we go through the year. It'll be one of the big talking points of the weather through the course of this year, and I'll keep you updated. That's it for now.